and maybe address some more general questions about PBL and about your experience doing PBL and about your experience being part of this. That's unrelated to this discussion. In this discussion, we are only, well, maybe starting with the 5 questions that you addressed, but we will see what else can we learn from one another about PBL and about how that has or has not changed the way you teach, even when you're not doing PBL. And
okay. Well, so I thought we would just start with the questions we have here, but if there are things that you feel like are relevant that we need to discuss that came up in your groups, we'd like to hear about that too. So the purpose of this discussion really is to kind of, for lack of a better word, unpack what you guys have been thinking about as you've been doing your implementations, and then how that relates to what you know about PBL and how it's impacted your practice, if at all. So the first question that we had listed there was basically, how do we know if we're implementing PBL? So we were asking you to identify some characteristics of PBL that differentiate it from other things you might do in your classroom. So what were some thoughts that you guys had about question number 1? How do we know if we're doing PBL versus just a different kind of project or just a regular lesson? What are some characteristics?
Well, we said that PBL was more hands-on than usual, and it gave students more of an opportunity to make connections between like real-world situations versus just the abstract that they usually see in the classroom.
Okay, so more connections to the real world instead of just an isolated math concept, right? Absolutely.
Well, we talked about how students are really the ones making the choices and the decisions during the process.
Okay, can you elaborate on that?
And that was one of our challenges too, to kind of act more as a facilitator rather than if they get stuck at a place, you don't want to just kind of give them the answer. You might want to lead them, but they get to decide the path that they take to solve the problem that we put in front of them.
Go here and
We discussed that there's more opportunities for the students to come up with their own particular pathway of solving the problem. There's not a pat answer to the problem.
I was saying the same thing, that each project or each activity is unique, so no one can cheat off of each other. They all have different destinations, like in my specific activity, but it's unique, and so they decide what's interesting to them along the way, and that's kind of guides them to different answers. No one group or person has the same project.
I want to comment on that. That, I think, it's a very important point that may also be part of the answer to other questions here. I see that as one, maybe a benefit of doing PBL, right? But if we were to describe to somebody who has not heard much about PBL, I think it's useful, for example, the first point about a hands-on activity, that it's not well-defined, etc. So what you expressed as a benefit of PBL, how would you say that as a characteristic of PBL to describe it to somebody who's new to implementing PBL in the classroom? I don't know if I explained myself well.
No, you did. I'm just trying to think of kind of just like a pinpoint idea. I mean, I just wrote down every project is unique. There's no 2 projects that are the same, and it can be due to different parameters that are changed, and that's given by the teacher. So you can give them specific things that have to happen, but then you leave so much open for their creativity, so they can still get the right answer, but it's unique to what's interesting to them.
So maybe what you just said, right, about being open.
Yes.
That would be a characteristic.
Don't tell them everything.
Our group said that PBL used the engineering process that we talked about before, meaning they design something or they research something, they design it, they test it out, they revise it, and then they redesign again. You know, and we found that going through our project, even though it's a graphing project, you know, they still had to test it. Oh, this is too hard. This isn't going to work. Let's redesign it. All of our students did, just it happens naturally. And I think that's something in PBL they have to go through that process. They start problem solving. Oh, it doesn't need to be this difficult. Oh, we can do this. Now I can add this on top of it to make it more cool or whatever. But that cycle is important for the PBL process.
I think one thing I noticed about the PBL and the activity is that the PBL either though leaves a lot of openness to the students, but the PBL is a lot more structured and it gives a lot of parameters that the students cannot or not supposed to cross. Doing a PBL give them restrictions that they have to follow at every single time compared to PB as an activity. Even though the PB, and that's what makes the final product of an activity to be all the same and the PBL all the different.
So they're comparable, but so they follow the same parameters, but they're not exactly the same.
Right.
Right. So that was okay. Other characteristics that differentiate it from traditional instruction?
I found that the projects also necessitated the need to really have group activity, which is not always what you do in a normal classroom. And the kids have to work together, and it arouses real competitiveness between the groups.
Not in here.
No, not us, we're just out there.
So y'all saw that in your classrooms too, with the competitions, that the students really bought into that part of it. Okay. So any other characteristics that you think differentiate it from other, like for example, if I just walk into a classroom and I see students working on a problem as a group, and maybe that problem has parameters or it's, you know, some sort of problem-based lesson versus a PBL problem, are there any other big differences between the two? Do you know what I'm asking? Like how, if I walked in, or if I were trying to implement PBL in my classroom, what are some things I need to remember so it's not just group work?
It's a long-term project. We started this at the beginning of the year, and we did a little piece of it. We added a piece to it. We're working towards the competition that we're going to have at the end of the term in January. But it's a semester project versus this is due today or even due at the end of the week. It's a much bigger picture. And they're adding pieces as we go. And sometimes we're adding a piece so we can teach the math that's associated with that piece.
I think what it is too is I also used some supplementary projects as well to lead up to my main PBL, and I think the main PBL has a deeper understanding, or we're trying to have the students reach a deeper understanding of the topic being taught, whereas just a project might be just on a particular component of the PBL. It's more the PBL is more focused.
One of the things, and I think we all kind of touched on it a little bit, but it has to pose a problem at the initial start of the project, and that's what I feel like makes it different from any activity that we would normally do, is that starting problem, and that's where they have the design process that they go through. They have to start with a question or posing real world problem that instigates thought on their own levels and then creates the diversity and the creativity.
But I also think the one thing nobody's mentioned is the fact that there's got to be a presentation someplace within there where the kids, after they get their feedback and revision, they have to present their results to the class.
I feel that if I'm looking at an activity to compare it to a PBL, one of the main differences is you have a question, but there's not one right answer. And so you have a solution, so each team or each person can have a solution, but it's just there's so many different ways to get to the right answer. And that's one of the main differences, instead of just saying, okay, the answer's 5.
That's unrelated to this discussion. In this discussion, we are only, well, maybe starting with the 5 questions that you addressed, but we will see what else can we learn from one another about PBL and about how that has or has not changed the way you teach, even when you're not doing PBL. And
Okay. Well, so I thought we would just start with the questions we have here, but if there are things that you feel like are relevant that we need to discuss that came up in your groups, we'd like to hear about that too. So the purpose of this discussion really is to kind of for lack of a better word, unpack what you guys have been thinking about as you've been doing your implementations, and then how that relates to what you know about PBL and how it's impacted your practice, if at all. So the first question that we had listed there was basically how do we know if we're implementing PBL? So we were asking you to identify some characteristics of PBL that differentiate it from other things you might do in your classroom. So what were some thoughts that you guys had about question number one? How do we know if we're doing PBL versus just a different kind of project or just a regular lesson? What are some characteristics?
Well, we said that PBL was more hands-on than usual, and it gave students more of an opportunity to make connections between like real-world situations versus just the abstract that they usually see in the classroom.
Okay, so more connections to the real world instead of just an isolated math concept, right? Absolutely.
Well, we talked about how students are really the ones making the choices and the decisions during the process.
Okay, can you elaborate on that?
And that was one of our challenges too, to kind of act more as a facilitator rather than if they get stuck at a place, you don't want to just kind of give them the answer. You might want to lead them, but they get to decide the path that they take to solve the problem that we put in front of them.
Go here and
We discussed that there's more opportunities for the students to come up with their own particular pathway of solving the problem. There's not a pat answer to the problem.
I was saying the same thing, that each project or each activity is unique, so no one can cheat off of each other. They all have different destinations, like in my specific activity, but it's unique, and so they decide what's interesting to them along the way, and that's kind of guides them to different answers. No one group or person has the same project.
I want to comment on that. That, I think, it's a very important point that may also be part of the answer to other questions here. I see that as one, maybe a benefit of doing PBL, right? But if we were to describe to somebody who has not heard much about PBL, I think it's useful, for example, the first point about a hands-on activity, that it's not well-defined, etc. So what you expressed as a benefit of PBL, how would you say that as a characteristic of PBL to describe it to somebody who's new to implementing PBL in the classroom? I don't know if I explained myself well.
No, you did. I'm just trying to think of kind of just like a pinpoint idea. I mean, I just wrote down every project is unique. There's no two projects that are the same, and it can be due to different parameters that are changed, and that's given by the teacher. So you can give them specific things that have to happen, but then you leave so much open for their creativity, so they can still get the right answer, but it's unique to what's interesting to them.
So maybe, and this is what you just said, right, about being open.
Yes.
That would be a characteristic.
Don't tell them everything.
We said, our group said that PBL used the engineering process that we talked about before, meaning they design something, or they research something, they design it, they test it out, they revise it, and then they redesign again. You know, and we found that going through our project, even though it's a graphing project, you know, they still had to test it. Oh, this is too hard. This isn't going to work. Let's redesign it. All of our students did. Just it happens naturally. And I think that's something in PBL. They have to go through that process. They start problem solving. Oh, it doesn't need to be this difficult. Oh, we can do this. Now I can add this on top of it to make it more cool or whatever. But that cycle is important for the PBL process.
I think one thing I noticed about the PBL and the activity is that the PBL either though leaves a lot of openness to the students, but the PBL is a lot more structured, and it gives a lot of parameters that the students cannot or not supposed to cross. Doing a PBL give them restrictions that they have to follow at every single time compared to PB as an activity. Even though the PB, and that's what makes the final product of an activity to be all the same, and the PBL all the different.
So they're comparable, but, so they follow the same parameters, but they're not exactly the same.
Right.
Right. So that leaves the overlap. Okay. Other characteristics that differentiate it from traditional instruction?
I found that the projects also necessitated the need to really have group activity, which is not always what you do in a normal classroom. And the kids have to work together, and it arouses real competitiveness between the groups.
Not in here.
No, not us, we're just out there.
So y'all saw that in your classrooms too, with the competitions, that the students really bought into that part of it. Okay. So any other characteristics that you think differentiate it from other, like for example, if I just walk into a classroom and I see students working on a problem as a group, and maybe that problem has parameters or it's, you know, some sort of problem-based lesson, versus a PBL problem, are there any other big differences between the two? Do you know what I'm asking? Like how, if I walked in, or if I were trying to implement PBL in my classroom, what are some things I need to remember so it's not just group work?
It's a long-term project. We started this at the beginning of the year, and we did a little piece of it. We added a piece to it. We're working towards the competition that we're going to have at the end of the term in January. But it's a semester project versus this is due today or even due at the end of the week. It's a much bigger picture. And they're adding pieces as we go. And sometimes we're adding a piece so we can teach the math that's associated with that piece.
I think what it is too is I also used some supplementary projects as well to lead up to my main PBL. And I think the main PBL has a deeper understanding, or we're trying to have the students reach a deeper understanding of the topic being taught. Whereas just a project might be just on a particular component of the PBL. It's more the PBL is more focused.
One of the things, and I think we all kind of touched on it a little bit, but it has to pose a problem at the initial start of the project, and that's what I feel like makes it different from any activity that we would normally do, is that starting problem, and that's where they have the design process that they go through. They have to start with a question or posing real-world problem that instigates thought on their own levels and then creates the diversity and the creativity.
But I also think the one thing nobody's mentioned is the fact that there's got to be a presentation someplace within there where the kids, after they get their feedback and revision, they have to present their results to the class.
I feel that if I'm looking at an activity to compare it to a PBL, one of the main differences is you have a question, but there's not one right answer. And so you have a solution, so each team or each person can have a solution, but it's just there's so many different ways to get to the right answer. And that's one of the main differences. Instead of just saying, okay, the answer's 5, or I got to this location. It's everyone's getting to their right solution, even though they're all different.
I also noticed that I just did an activity, but if you're doing a PBL, you're building on a whole lot of teaks. And eventually, they see the teaks that if they've already used them, you know, as part as being a facilitator, when they're doing, like, I'm going to have my students do this project, but I facilitate them along the way saying, every time we touch on a teak, we need to annotate that in our project. And they're seeing the correlation. I'm sleepy, y'all. They're seeing the correlation between what is actually the project at the end focus and how we've covered, showing them how we've covered all the math teaks while they're doing it, because it's a lot of teaks with my project, because I just did activity. But in the end results, the list of teaks is long, and they see how they've used the math in that project in the end. And that's what they, that makes them understand, and they get a visual feeling. Because when I give them a worksheet, I'm just doing busy work, but with a physical project, they can see how the math is being used in a real world situation, and how all these TEKs that I've been posting on the board every day relate to life. And that's important for our students. That's it. Take the camera.
Well, so let's move on to the second question. How do we implement these in the classroom? What needs to be in place? What kinds of things do you have to think about in your classroom setting?
First of all, you got to get to know your students and make sure you're well versed in the TEKs and have classroom management. So when you're delivering the driving question, it's clear to your students and the expectations are high. So they understand, hey, this is what I'm going to be allowed to do, and then give them the freedom to make mistakes and try again.
That last thing that you said was one of our challenges, was getting the kids comfortable enough in the classroom so that they can take risks and make mistakes and then go back and fix them, because they come in always having to have the right answer, and they have to pass the test, and they have to get the correct answer, and so changing their mindset in a math classroom, we said, was one of the challenges.
So let me stop right, I'll come to you in a second, I promise, I know you've been waiting. So that seems like a really important point. So changing the student's mindset, because they're so used to maybe either step-by-step instruction, or there being one right answer, and so they say, like, Miss, just tell me how to do it, right? Something like that. How do you do that? What are some things that you can do in your classroom to help get the students comfortable and have them take risks and see mistakes as actually a learning experience that will make their end product better?
I can answer that too.
Okay, great. Perfect.
Just smaller activities. Like
Okay.
he was saying that he started his off with smaller projects, and then that led to the bigger project.
Okay.
Right? Because you could just, and I know that you guys did a catapult, was it last year?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then they started off with just some video, and then they started off with just something real small to catapults, and then it eventually led to a big project, but they did smaller pieces, just step by step. So they set them up, and they got them used to working in groups just a little bit here, okay, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and then moving on, and then eventually it got to the, okay, now this is your group, you need to come up with something grand instead of just something,
Right.
so,
Okay.
yeah.
So easing them into it.
A couple of things I do before I work into how I'm going to implement the PBL is I'll give them a set of like warm-ups that lead up to it. That way they become more comfortable. And in the very like initial 1 or 2 warm-ups, we'll ask questions and discuss. I'll let them know that there's I'll be very lenient with wrong answers. As a matter of fact, I probably won't even count them wrong at all. So long as you give me some kind of input, that way I can see your train of thought on the subject, and then correct it, and then eventually I could get more critical with the questions and get a little bit more deeper into the warm-ups, and that when I see that they're comfortable with the subject, then we can move on to the PBL. So that's probably what I'll do. Incorporate maybe some homework, definitely some warm-ups. Maybe a quiz or or an informal assessment to see that I know that they know, but I want them to know about the PBL. Is it clear?
Well, first off, I guess naturally, I think most of us will try and create an environment where the kids feel safe. Okay, we normally go over wrong answers. Why was this one wrong? What did they do? Or every now and then, like on a warm-up or something, and the answers pop up, and you see all these correct answers, and there's that one really wrong answer. I go like, "Yay! There's a wrong answer. How do we fix it?" I mean, you make them feel comfortable. It's okay to make mistakes because we learn how to fix them. So if you start off by creating that kind of environment where it's all right to make mistakes, but we just use that as a tool to correct things, they won't be so scared to try. Because that's something that I think we saw. Some of the kids were scared to try, but the majority of them, they went forward and they kept on going. So I think, like I said, as long as you create that environment and celebrate the chance to correct mistakes, they'll be okay.
And did you find there's a difference between, I'm kind of jumping around on the questions just because this is where the conversation is going, I hope that's okay. But when you're thinking about how students were engaging with PBL and with when you're implementing your projects, was there a difference in terms of engagement between non-PBL and PBL tasks?
Oh.
And understanding all of those things?
Yeah, I definitely feel when I was talking to my group, I was telling them, like, I have students that normally do not interact in class at all, or on a very limited basis because they struggle. And with mine, I did the Angry Birds, but with linear equations, so y'all are usually pretty familiar with that. But I had kids that took an active role that normally don't. They sit back and wait for someone else to do it for them. And I have one learner who, it takes him probably at least a couple minutes to write a sentence. Like, he is a very, very slow student, and I have to literally sit there and baby step it with him, which is fine. I mean, he tries, and I cut the project in half for him, and he actually completed my project by himself, and it was like a huge win for me, because he typically fails all of his tests. He doesn't do his homework. He doesn't really do much of anything unless I sit there with him, and in a class of 25, even with a co-teacher, I don't have a lot of time to do that. And with this, he did most of his project in one day and was so successful. And yesterday, when he walked in, I was like, by the way, you got an 80 on your project. And we high-fived, and he just was like, he didn't know what to do because he's never had that success in class. And we did something yesterday, and he was actually actively trying to participate because he had that success in this project, which was a huge win for me.
And do you feel like he learned content as well? So the
Yes.
engagement was there, but was the content also
Oh,
there?
definitely. Like, I showed him one time how to make the equation with the points. He actually labeled his own points, and he actually made the equation. It's using the calculator, but if that's the tool, I mean, they have that tool available. Why not? And he was able to do it on his own. Like, I walked him through one. After that, he was on his own, and he did it.
Yes. Okay, so I, being a coach, I often relate to, hey, guys, you may not have hit the target, but right now it's practice. Leading up to the project, the culmination of the end, you got to realize, hey, you're practicing along the way. A lot of times students are like, okay, I need a right or a wrong answer because that's my grade. I'm like, we don't grade you on practice. We grade you on participation. We grade you on participation and then getting to the end. And if once they get that comfortable, like, okay, this is just practice. This is just me trying. This is just me working out. I tell them about, all right, Muhammad Ali, one of the greatest boxers, hated practice, but he did it enough that he was successful when it was time to fight. And I talked about how Kobe Bryant, known for the amount of points he's made, how many shots has he taken. And I'm like, hey, it doesn't matter as long as you're aware that, hey, the end in mind, focus on the project. So, okay, when you're participating, they see that success, like, oh, okay, like one of my students, like you said, he's engaged, he's trying, but it's kind of off the mark. Okay, how can you bring that back? Because this is a good base, a good foundation. And once they see, oh, okay, I'm in the ballpark, and I don't have a 0 or a failing grade, they get excited, and they participate. So, yeah.
Little wins.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
You know what, I see something common here, and I believe it's the mindset that the student has when they're doing a PBL. It's not as critical as it is a regular assignment. It's more relaxed. The student has a better, it's just more relaxed when they go in there. And they try more, and it becomes less of an effort for them to solve something. So it's definitely a mindset thing when they're doing the PBL. And that's probably why I think that they do better or understand better, because they're actively trying to do something instead of just use everything just all mental. They're both connecting the mental and the physical doing something.
So because they have that kind of connection to something more manipulative or concrete, they are able to have a more almost like more access to the content, right? Like they're able to access the content more easily.
I'm doing it. Well, I did this activity, the growing pains, and it's Y = mx. They already know about the constant. We went over that already. But we were doing this, and all they were doing was building the stages, because we got to generate the equation in the form of Y = mx. N plus B later. And one of the students, she was doing it, filling it out, and it was a constant rate. They figured that out. But I left on the table, not just the X and Y, you know, input, output. I put the little middle column in there because I was trying to tie it into, I had these same students last year. I have all special ed students. So I was trying to tie it in, and maybe they'll see it and come up with it. And she raised her hand, and they there working, and she said, Ms. Isaac, yes. She said, we did something like this last year. Something's got to go right up here. I said, you remember what it was? And it, you know, I was going to scaffold later, but she scaffolded right there for me. And that led the way to, what did we call that? And she said, and she looked at it, and she said, we're going to do 2X. But that was sequence and series in 7th grade, and I taught these same students. And then finally, but she didn't remember the word, called on somebody else, and he said, it has a name. Another student, they have a name. I said, well, I gave him a hint of maybe it began with an S. And he said sequence. So they remembered that. She said, no, it's got more names. And I taught it as, that's your expression, that's your rule, that's your process. And that was how I taught it last year. And so they immediately, he said sequence because I said S. And she said, no, it had some other names. So it really tied it in when they started building it, the constant rate. And I have a really low one in there that he just came. And I didn't have him the last couple of years. So it's a lot of gaps in there. You know, he was totally lost, but he saw it and he got it also because he was physically building it with the sequence and stuff. But he didn't know any of those words. But I can see it. And then they even noticed that it was gonna, she said, well, sometimes, didn't we put it like this and do the parenthesis? They remembered from last year the way I taught sequence and series, that led to, we're gonna change the names. It's gonna be Y equal MX. And y'all know what M is because I've already taught slope. So they knew that, and it's time some. She said, well, you can add or subtract sometime up there too. Thank you for scaffolding for me, you know, and it made it a lot easier when they, you know, but I kind of, with the thing, instead of just going input, output, I put that middle column in there for the table for them, you know, but they're special ed. I got to, you know, do whatever I can. You know, use every trick in the book.
I found that PBL could be a good way to differentiate instructions. Usually, building on what she was saying before, it looks to me like the kids that are doing better, they get better engaged in PBL kind of activity, are different from the from the students that actually perform better with traditional kind of learning. So it's like, I mean, sometimes some of the students, last year was my first time really implementing some of the projects, and I was really impressed by some of the kids that they never do anything in my class. And during PBL, actually, they were the ones driving the process. So it was very, very impressive. I mean, and on the other hand, I was disappointed because I have you know, very, very smart and very mathematically inclined students that really didn't put any effort into it because they just wanted to have something, you know, give me something I need to do, I'll do it, it's done, and, you know, I don't want to think about it after, you know, after school or whatever. And so it was kind of an experience. And again, I think that could be seen as a differentiating instruction kind of strategy as well. Maybe you do it with some students, maybe not with all of them.
I had a very similar experience where I had a student who usually will have somebody else come and help him with his work, but then he was the one leading the PBL project. And then I had my GT students, like my students who are off the charts, who tried to find any loophole possible to get out of it. Because those GT students are good at traditional schooling. And that's what they're good at. And they're good at, you know, there has to be a right answer. And then when it came to this project, they tried to find every way to get out of it. And it was hilarious. And they didn't do as well as you would expect our top kids to do in this PBL environment because they're not used to doing that type of work. And I just found it really interesting, the same experience where my top kids
not so much, but my lower kids, it really brought them to the forefront where they felt they could take control, and it was like a fresh start. It was something that we hadn't done. It wasn't, vocabulary that they haven't done so well on previously, every unit so far. It was a whole new project, a whole new environment that they kind of got a fresh slate to do their best and try something different. And so I thought it worked really well.
Did anyone else have that experience? And then I'll come to your comments. Did anyone else have that experience where it was almost like your lower kids were able to, yeah?
I've read articles before where pre-AP students and GT students will often choose to not do something because they're afraid of being shown to not be smart.
Yeah.
If that's the word.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what it is. Because now that y'all are talking about it, and I'm looking back at the kids who keep forgetting their projects, they're my A students.
Yeah.
They're my A. They're the higher kids in the class. They're the ones, and I'm wondering if they're afraid of doing something wrong. Meanwhile, all my other kids that have like a really good grade in my class right now, they're my LEP kids who never do homework, my LEP kids who never finish their classwork, and they're the most attitudey ones, and they're doing really well right now. They're forcing their boyfriends and girlfriends and friends to come into tutoring, and they're yelling at them in tutoring, and they're like, no, you do it like this, and it's really funny, but they're taking a lot of pride in their projects. And then it flipped. It really did flip, and I think they're afraid of being, of failing. They're not, because they're being asked to be creative. Yeah.
Don't you think the state test has lent itself to you always have to have the right answer?
Yes.
Because they have to be right.
Yeah.
They're either right or they're wrong.
Mhm.
So now you're flipping the switch, so to speak, and it's very difficult. And then that's probably one of the challenges as a teacher, because if you're teaching Algebra 1, you've got all these TEKs and everything to cover for the state test. So you have a lot of parameters there, and then you're trying to get a project that has maybe no right answer, per se, everybody, different outcomes, and it's very difficult. It's probably easier now for a geometry teacher or an Algebra 2 teacher, because they don't have a state test as a constraint. So they can do a lot better flipping that switch like that.
But I think the kids have been conditioned.
Yes.
They've been conditioned to take a test. That's the biggest problem. How do you get them?
Right answer.
It's hard to get them unconditioned.
We taught the critical thinking out of them.
Because of the test.
Well, the part of, I think the part that really bothers mine is the creating part. Because we give them the framework of the project, but then so much of it is what they choose to create. And I think that is the part of instruction that, because of testing, and that's the best part. That's where it all comes full circle. That gets left out of not just mathematics, but English and science and all the rest of them. So they have no basis for going back to something to help them to create, because very rarely do they have to create anything anywhere, other than maybe writing a short essay or whatever on, and even, I'm not even gonna get into that, but it's like, and so when all of a sudden we're telling them that's a lot of their project is what they choose to create out of it.
Right. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Biological processes involved in this. Stress and relaxation. Stress, you might be taking a test or having to answer questions. Relaxation, project-based learning, fight or flight. When you're under stress, biologically, this happens with everyone. Your brain releases adrenaline into the bloodstream. Do you know what adrenaline does? It's a memory blocker. You get uncomfortable, you stress, you lose what you've been taught or learned under stressful conditions. When you're relaxed, you come back and you remember those things. Adrenaline is a memory blocker. And that's probably one of the reasons why some of these children do not do so well in tests. They stress. If they would learn to stress, if you could teach them to relax under those conditions, you might do better. But you can check it out. It's called Fight or Flight, and you can look at the biological processes and how they relate to test taking and other things. Adrenaline's a memory blocker, in short.
Okay, well, so while we're on the subject of kind of the stress or the struggle between standardized testing and project-based learning, which it sounds like was very positive for a lot of your students who maybe traditionally underachieve on the standardized test. I guess my first question is, how do you reconcile that? Do you think it's worth it? Does it take too much time away from test prep? Or how do you, like, as a teacher, reconcile that?
I think we have to get away from just, they don't learn as well. I really feel like spending I spent 3 days basically on this project, and I feel like they learned more in that 3 days than we spent 2 weeks on this same lesson. And I feel like they learned more in those 3 days. And mind you, yes, they've learned it before, so they're just revisiting it. But I feel like if I had to put this in when they did it, they would recall it better, because I've had students come in doing other, like they're doing homeworks and whatnot, and they're like, oh yeah, that's what we did on our Angry Birds. Great. Like they're remembering because they had so much enjoyment, and one little kicker, you know, they got it, and versus a worksheet, and they're just, it's regurgitating. Yeah, they learn it for that moment, and then after that it's gone.
Yeah, okay. So retention, it helps with retention.
Definitely, and it's something they'll remember, because if you put it in, like a lot of these activities are stuff that relates to them in some way. Something they, you know, I'm just looking around like pill bottles and logos and Barbies, and just those are things that they're sitting there in La La Land, they're gonna think, oh, I did Barbie, what did that, what did I do with that?
That just might be the relaxed and the stressful condition again.
Okay.
I was just gonna add on to her. I know with mine, the Barbie Bungee, I started with them. They had to get their own data, and then they came up with the slope off of that, and it's linear. And then basically that was the first time that I introduced the concept of point slope form. They had never seen it before. In fact, I'd never even taught it before. So, and when they got to that, they asked me, they're like, sir, how do I set up with this? And I helped them set up, and then I go, now you gotta solve for y. Now you gotta get the slope intercept form. And that was in the end of October, so it was like the 31st or 30th, right around there. Now, I just past week, I'm doing point slope form as an actual lesson, and it's like, I go, remember this? I told them, I go, you see this formula? I go, do you remember this formula on that project that we said? It was right there. And oh yeah, and they just remembered it. And even now, it's a month later, they still were able to, oh yeah, I remember seeing that. I remember doing that. Oh, I remember, and they just did it. And this week was really easy.
Wow.
I think you point to some interesting things about what's different when you're doing the project, and some have mentioned motivation. It's more fun, it's more interesting, or the physiological basis of things that they do. I think what you're describing to me makes me think it is also about how they are being engaged. It's not only that they're engaged, putting some physical thing together, but they are being engaged in figuring out stuff, right? I mean, when you answer that question to those students, they wanted to know the answer. You didn't tell them, okay, now you need to know this because I think you should know it. They needed that answer. They asked you, you tell them. Now they have to figure things out. And that cognitive engagement, the part when they have to think and figure things out mathematically, I think that's also a great contribution to why they may remember this better later, because they're learning it in a more profound way. They figure it out on their own to solve a problem that the project presented.
Wasn't it the $1 million question we all ask, and all the kids ask, why do we need to learn this? We're never going to use this in life. And I think these projects answer that question for them. They never thought, oh, I would use a linear, or some of you did it as a quadratic to do this. Like that's never crossed their mind that they would see math in all these different ways. I mean, even from a logo and the way it's designed, to the pill bottles, to the Angry Birds, to all these different things that have something to do with them, and they've never looked at it that way. And they always want to know, why do I have to know this? Why do I need to learn this? And the answer can't be because you have to pass a test. Because to them, that is the stupidest answer you'll ever give them. So when you do these things, there's your $1 million answer. Look at where you see it. Look at how it can be applied. Yeah, it seems stupid to you now, but you don't even realize how much math is in your life and in everything that we do. And that's where you need it.
And also, with these real world problems, we also, in my group, we assigned them, or in a lot of the projects, they were assigned these roles. So we had architects in training, we had, city planners and design engineers. And so they're also seeing these career pathways where this is used in the real world as well, where people do this for a living.
When I started this, my hook was our 8th grade have a big dance every year. And I used the dance costs $5. How much will the PTA make, or whoever gets the money? I think I said PTA. How much money they make based on X number of students purchasing the tickets. And they really, and I think that's, especially with the special ed students, if you don't tie it to something real world where they see it's an application for it. Because I never mentioned, when we did the little hook one of the dance, I never mentioned constant rate. I had taught it already. I didn't mention that. I let them, they were doing it. And the students, well, one student, the really low one, he said, once he put it in the table, he automatically put that stuff on the side, automatically did the X's and the Y's, because I taught him with the little V's on the side. And this is 2, that's 1, this is 2, that's 1. He wrote it as a unit rate. He wrote Y over X. And I never told him to do that. I just said how much for X number of tickets. How much money could we possibly make? Because I was leading up to, let's generate this equation. And they automatically, and he real low, I mean, I'd be like praying, I need a shovel. I need a shovel. Dig him up. But he automatically on that table, and that was a previous lesson, which I was going to get to that, eventually when I try to go to let's generate the equation later on, but he got there himself, because he remembered, like you said, and he saw it. Okay, we did this, that's the table, I'm going to do this. And he tied it in. And the dance got him. And then first thing they say, when is the dance? I don't know, that PTA run that. But I know they know we have that big dress-up dance every year. So I did that. Can I add my challenge? Oh, no, I'll wait. I had a challenge.
Okay, yeah, we're about to.
Yeah, we'll wait. Oh, that's next?
I was just going to say, our project at Whittier Middle School was, our driving question was whether or not the Olympic races were judged fairly, because our 2012 Olympic racer, Bolt, was the fastest man in the world, but he was also the tallest competitor. And what I thought was interesting was that the students never realized that they could use math to be like agents of change, and that they could use math to prove that something might be unfair or biased. So we had our students, my grade level, wrote a letter to the International Olympic Committee explaining how they could use math to prove a bias in the judging. And I just think that connection was really cool to see.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do we have another comment over here? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about some challenges. What are some challenges that you felt were pretty relevant as you were going through this as a teacher? What kinds of challenges did you face?
Time was one.
Time? Okay, so
Time
talk
was-
about that a little more.
And in our whole little group right here, time seemed to be the biggest challenge to implement it, but we thought as a solution, if the second time around, it'll be easier to fit into our calendar because you have this constraint with your curriculum guide for the district and a couple of middle school people that were over here with all new teaks and everything. I mean, that had to be a tremendous challenge.
So you don't see it, it seems like something additional you have to do, not something that can take the place of the things that are in your curriculum guide, is that right?
Well,
You know what I'm saying?
that's what we tried.
We
We
tried.
tried it that way.
Okay.
You know, it was
Instead of this
part of our curriculum. We tried to build it, and it ended up causing more issues. At least with our project, it did. It ended up causing more issues because students were not coming in prepared to actually do what we needed to do. We discovered that, in case something should happen, we should have something available because we wanted to tie it into our curriculum. Like if we wanted to find the slope that day, hey, we can use our project. The kids can work on their project and figure out the slope for these lines, and well, the kids come in and they don't have their stuff, so we can't do practice with that. So we ended up pushing it just to Fridays only instead of trying to mix it in during the week. So just Fridays only, and then and we went back to our regular lessons. So just that additional day for the project is what it turned into.
We finally had to take
The project's away from them.
And so
Because
you're,
they stopped bringing them on Friday.
Yeah.
So
but
they
your
wouldn't do anything.
self-motivated student kind of punished
Right.
because you took it away, and they're the ones that will take it home and continue working on it.
Yep.
But you had to do it just in case they didn't bring it back.
Right.
So that was one reason why, we haven't finished.
We
that
started doing
project.
Remind 101. We started, tell everyone that they need, announcements. I mean, it.
So time and then also student
Student
preparedness.
responsibility.
There you go.
They're just, the ninth graders, we, on our discussion, they're almost like still middle school.
Yes, they really are.
And homework to them is, it's something
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah.
Bring in a design. So we discovered we should have had designs, and when that day came and they didn't have it, there's your design. Sorry, you're now using my design. Because you want,
if they didn't bring it in.
but they didn't bring their own.
Yeah.
We gave them an opportunity to do their own because we thought, okay, that would create the excitement if it's their own.
We started out excited about doing it. We're like, okay, we can. It'll actually be part of our learning process throughout the week. Whenever we're learning about slope, and we're learning about slope in step 4, we'll use it. But then there was just so many kids that were forgetting their things that we had to change it.
If I did it, if I do it again, it would be in groups.
Yes, that's what we were talking about. Because
We've already
yes,
seen how we can remedy.
towards the end, we found that if we paired them up, like with a kid who was already done, if we paired them up with a kid who wasn't done, that worked out well because they were like, "You're gonna do this, do
Right.
it now,"
Yeah.
they had their one-on-one,
We're
and
gonna finish it.
Yeah.
we will finish it.
I'm
Yes.
determined. But he's gonna get in that calculator.
I only did it with, my period is split. I have 2 grade levels in one period, 7 and 8, and I'm doing the new TEKS also. And the challenge I faced in just doing it, I only have 3 8th graders, so I chose to do it with them. The 7th graders were jealous. They kept trying to come back, but they had their own work to do. And I do have a paraprofessional in there also, but they can't explain, and, they want Miss Isaacs to give them, but they kept seeing it. And so I think when I go to the next phase of I just did activity this time. When I go to the next phase of doing the actual project, I'm going to assign iPad something else for the 7th graders so I can focus specifically on my 8th graders, because I kept running back and forth and they were trying to do stuff and I'm trying to, facilitate them, and it wasn't working out.
So the structure of your class made it difficult.
Yeah, it was the structure of the class more so.
I feel like today's way the schedules are worked out are not really made for PBL. I mean, the 45, 50-minute schedule doesn't really bode well for PBL. The schedule is made for, having a static lesson and then give students some transition time to get ready for the next lesson so they get some movement going. With PBL, students should be engaged, should be part of the learning process, and you need to have more time. I spend too much time transitioning rather than actually allowing them to do their work. Especially if you use technology in your classroom, transition time is huge. You use probably 50% of your time effectively. So if you really want to implement PBL correctly, you need to have a different schedule that doesn't work around a 45-minute, time schedule. I mean, it doesn't work well. It just wastes about 50% of your time just to set up the classroom. It doesn't really work well. It's a big challenge.
Fortunately for me, this year our campus changed their schedule to where we do like a whole semester. Do a whole year in a semester, and we're doing blocks. So I have them every single day for an hour and a half. So it made my project perfect. It was 2 weeks done, and that was great.
So a block schedule really does help.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay. What are some other challenges y'all face? We've heard time, we've heard student responsibility, structure.
I know when we're looking at like some of the questions and materials, I know you guys were able to help us, a lot of us out with getting materials, but when looking at the future and implementing other projects, having those materials, because my campus, well, I'm sure a lot of our campuses don't want to give us the funds to purchase things. Like they give you a standard budget, and it's like we have to buy markers and other necessary supplies, I guess. So some of the projects, like I really want to do Catapult, I want to do the bridge, but asking the students to buy it is not realistic, and purchasing it on our own is definitely not going to happen. So, I mean, it depending on the cost, it's a lot, and if you're trying to do it with individuals or smaller groups, you're looking at a lot of supplies and a lot of materials. So that's definitely an issue. Like our budget is ridiculous. Like I didn't get any funds to spend for my classroom at all this year. Like my department isn't buying me anything. We don't have anything. So everything that I have in my classroom was purchased by me, and it doesn't last because the kids don't take care of it because it's not theirs. So that's definitely a big thing. And I know with his it was technology, and that goes into the supplies too. If you want calculators, computers, anything that you normally don't have, it is a struggle to get those things for some campuses.
I think one challenge that everybody faces, at least in my case too, is the prior planning to actually implement the project. Because, say for example, we get to talk and listen to the others and do an activity or a short PBL, say Catapult, and we try to implement the same thing without planning for the students as much as we needed to. So I think it would be good if we have maybe a certain checklist or some sort of documents that everybody should complete before start the project. That would, put a lot of pressure off of us, because we kind of end up going to a place where we have to tweak while we are doing, and then that makes students confused about, well, you told us this and now is this. We know why we are doing that, but students get confused, and that makes it even worse for the teachers.
So, and maybe that's one of the things, like, this relates to the role of teacher, and also it being like a first-time implementation, right? Because I think we experienced that too as facilitators, and here were some things that came out that were not anticipated and caused a lot of friction in that first year, especially. Just a little bit of friction. No friction. It was smooth sailing. So, but maybe like building a bank of activities with things that you need to think about or prep for, or materials you need to have, all of that stuff. Parameters that work best instead of, because I think that was something we ran into, right? Was certain parameters were unclear or interpreted differently. So, okay.
One of the things I found that really helps for time management is to set very clear, measurable goals for the end of a class period or set of time. For example, by the end of today, you must have this piece. And so the students, it helps focus the students' efforts and keep them on track. For example, on our day one, you must have your experiment defined in a rough draft, outlined with the details. On day two, you must have finished collecting your data. Because if I just tell the students, you need to do this and you have 3 days, at the end of 2.5 days, not much has happened. Right. And so by giving them the small deliverables and the time that they need to have that done, it creates intensity and also focus for them, and it really helped move the project along a little bit better.
Yeah, and it might help with the time issue, right? Like if you have just little chunks of time, which is not ideal anyway, but you can think about what parts of the project would be able to be done by then. Other challenges that you wanted to mention?
Grading.
Yeah. Okay, so can you elaborate?
Yes. My kids did a water park project where they got to design their own water park. And there were 11 things they had to put on there. And anyway, but in the project, there were 5 math things they had to do. They had to find slope. They had to come up with the midpoint, the distance. They had to convert the distance to actual dimensions, and they had to write an equation. Anyway, so there were 10 problems for each one of those 5 math things. And so I told them at the end of the project, after they were finished and they turned it in, I told them I was grading 1 of the 10 on each math concept. Because there was no way I was going to be able to grade all 10. And as it was, I have 163 students. I had 127 projects turned in on time, which I took home over Thanksgiving break and I graded. And I tracked my time, 11 hours, to grade those. And so then, of course, I had one kid that was flipping out on me when he failed because he had missed a couple of them. And so he failed. And so he just kept saying, I understand. You only graded the 1, but what about all this other work? And I tried to explain to him that it would have taken me 10 times as long if I had graded all 10 of everything. And I said, that would have been 110 hours. And I said, and over Thanksgiving break, if you count that we slept probably 8 hours a night, that was only 144 hours available. I'm not spending 110 hours of my 144 hours grading papers. Yeah, okay, so it took a lot of time. And I don't want to give them, like, say, okay, their help center has to be here and their water slide here, it has to be here, because then that takes away all the flexibility. So I don't really know what an easier way would be to grade, because I really did like the project, other than making them do it together, have partners, which I don't really want to do, because again, I want to see what they each can do.
Right.
But it was a lot of fun, but it was a lot of grading. It was a lot of grading.
A few years ago, I taught computer science, and it was all project-based, and that was actually one of the challenges. And just the act of opening their files in the correct place, running their 5-minute project, and then going through their rubric was a lot of time. One of the things that I did to help my grading was that I added a column in their rubric where they had to prove, they had to justify and prove that part of the rubric and assign themselves some points. And so I would watch their projects as they were working, but then when I was grading their project, I was only looking at their rubric. And so I could look at their project as a whole, but then I was analyzing, they stated they would give a screen capture of, I completed this part, and then they would justify, and to this extent. And so I was really looking only at the rubric, assigning them points, which was, I was able to just fly through the grading, because we were doing a project a week, and I had 90 students. And so that's one of the ways that I helped manage that grading part, because it really was, initially when I was doing it all myself and hunting for the piece that matched this criteria, it was just taking too long.
Said to have a mini checklist to help the students complete the project. So you're doing a little mini stuff as you go along, and then at the end, you just needed to look on the rubric.
So every Friday, there was something due.
Yeah.
And we needed to see that. For me, to make it even easier for me, I printed out my seating chart and I walked her and I did spot checks. Did you complete this check? Did you complete this check? How much did you get? All right, you only get an 80 for that. Like I just ran through 5 minutes before, talked to every single kid and did spot checks. So every Friday I'd made sure that they were where they were supposed to be. So, and then the final thing would actually be looking at the rubric for the final project. But I know that they did everything up to that point. So that's how we did grades.
Yeah, I was wondering if you guys had any parents buying into your project. I mean, did you get any feedback from parents? I mean, I had actually, the reason why I'm asking, because I had one parent actually was very happy. I mean, they just called me up and they were happy that I was doing something that was, business related, that, they were actually, I think that they did the project more than actually, but yeah, it was interesting. Yeah, exactly. So I was wondering if you guys had any
My project was about the shopping spree I gave them to renovate their house, and then they get to go on certain websites to buy certain stuff for their different rooms of the house. And then a lot of kids, they just found out that you can't just go and buy a bed, you have to buy a mattress and the box and the frame all separately. And then girls got all freaked out. They decided that they will never get married because it's too expensive to own a house. And a lot of parents were appreciative of it, that I get to make them do that because they learn how much the parents have to work hard for them to provide for all that. So that was something I experienced.
I looked at your is that you over there, the big poster? I'm gonna steal that. Okay, I like that.
I have my hand out. I'll put it over there. You can just pick one.
Okay, yeah.
I had a lot of parent participation. My students had to market their product that they designed. And so I had a lot of parents in the commercials. And I thought it was absolutely, and grandparents, I thought it was absolutely hilarious. And little brothers and sisters, because their product had to also be child-proof as well as arthritis-friendly. So it was, the family involvement in these projects, I think, can be really, really helpful and just hilarious and funny and great. The kids loved it, and they brought it home and shared it with their parents, which is, getting those parents engaged in what the students are doing in school. So I thought it was beneficial.
So let me I want to ask a couple of wrap-up questions. The first one is about number 5. How do you know PBL is working? I think we asked you to name the 5 most important outcomes that should emerge from a PBL implementation. And I want to hear just a couple of thoughts about that first. So what are some outcomes that you think are most important if you're implementing? So if you were, again, talking to a teacher who hadn't done this before, and they said, well, how do I know if it's working? What would you say?
Students ask to do more of this.
Okay.
Students say how much fun they had, and can we do more of this? Can we do this again? When you have those great days, and they're asking that, there's something.
They want more of it. Okay.
I think you get the genuine engagement. It's not just ritual, fill out the form, turn it in. They're actually sharing ideas. They're synthesizing. They're doing lots of great things, and they remember it better, like we talked about earlier.
Right, the retention.
carries
Yeah, that's
over.
a big thing too.
The students in my classroom, the conversation was very mathematical, and so they're asking each other for help within their groups. But then on their own, they're going and helping other groups out on their own, wanting to share what they know. I had a kid going to sharpen his pencil, heard these kids arguing about the slope of this line or the domain and what they're supposed to have on it, and he just stopped by and said, "No, that's not what it says right here on the notes." I mean, sometimes they're rude about it, but they're helping each other out, and so I'll take it.
You have that poster up that says like we retain like certain percentages, and if you're teaching someone else, that's the highest percentage, right? So if you have some of that incorporated into the group work, that seems like a really powerful tool. Have it in mind.
And I think if majority of the students are on your provided deadline, and that also tells us that they are on track, and that projects is going well. But that's usually what happens. They run out of time and they never complete it.
Right.
Students ask you to call their parents so that they can stay till 7 o'clock working on their project?
Yes. Yes. My mom's not gonna believe me.
When I did this, we had already did constant rate, and my super low guy said, "Why didn't you teach it like this? Why didn't you teach constant rate using this?" And I'm like, I looked at him, you asking me? Because I had already taught it. And he said, "Why didn't you teach constant rate using the tiles like this?" And I was like, okay, that's a good idea. So next year when I teach constant rate, I'm going to use these tiles. You just gave me something. But that came from him, because I had already taught it. And he's 8th grade. He has one of these. You don't really have to do too much with this, too much calculation, because it does everything with the table and they're for it then. You just need to show them how to use it. But he wanted to know why I didn't use the tiles to teach constant rate. And I'm like, you know, you real low, baby. Where that question come from? But he enjoyed it, but he saw the connection, and and then he done told me I should have taught it that way. And so next year when I teach constant rate, I'm using tiles for the new students. They can see it and they'll see it better. So he gave me something. I learned something, and that would have been a good way to teach it. You know, so.
Other outcomes that you thought were important?
I had kids making connections between the content. Like from what we did this earlier this week, I can do that way. Or I'd be giving instruction, okay, so you need to find the rest of your slopes, and they don't want to use a calculator and they don't want to use a formula. And one of my boys just got mad. He goes, why don't you just count the rise and the run? And all the kids were like, what? You can do rise and run on our project? You know, so they're making the connections and telling each other what to do. And you hear during the week, during the lesson, they're like, oh, like what we did on the project. That's why we did that. You know, so we heard a lot of comments like that.
So, students.
Connections.
Yeah, that seems like a really important outcome. That instead of, again, this goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the conversation, instead of that isolated content knowledge they just regurgitate or remember for a second. I think somebody said it's there and then it's gone. They're actually making connections, which it's an interesting point to me because of the time issue. So when you think about you can get through more material if you just teach it direct instruction, but they might not remember as much, so you have to think about what's really going to benefit them. I mean, in life, of course, but even on the test, because I know a lot of us are under that pressure, right? So if you can spend more time on things and make certain things explicit, will they remember it better, which might benefit them more on the test than you've gotten through all the material, but they're not going to remember half of it, right? It's kind of
Something else with the STAR test that I've been noticing. They keep giving these real world scenarios for all this math. And the kids don't see the connection. And I think with the PBL and a lot of the newer textbooks, I don't, we have McGraw-Hill. They give us careers at the beginning, give us all our essential questions right there in the textbook, and use real world applications. Like, I think one of them was the ramp for slope, and showing people skiing and skateboarding and stuff like that. They're trying to tie it in more to real world. And when they see it in the real world, it sticks better than, okay, you need to find the slope. I done told you it's a slant of a line, how steep it is. I mean, that's boring. They don't see any connection to the world. But I showed a little video on when I did introduce slope. People skiing and had a little bunny cartoon, and they loved it. And I called it Mr. Baxter. They all know Mr. Baxter. That's Mr. Baxter. You know, and it made it real world for them because they could actually see it. People's names was in the video because the 8th grade teachers made it up. You know. So they,
okay, one more question that I want to ask, and then we'll wrap this up. And that is about, your own practice as a teacher. So this relates to question 3 here, the role of a teacher in PBL. So I'm thinking about, like, what kinds of practices do you need to do to be able to facilitate PBL? And then kind of the second part of that I also want you to talk about is, has that bled over into other parts of your practice, even when you're not implementing a PBL lesson? So are there specific things that maybe you did during your PBL implementation or that you learned about practice during your implementation that then you might use in even other parts of your practice? Does that make sense? Kind of? Okay, so even if you're not doing a project, you're still using some of those practices. Does anyone have a thought about that? So practices or ways they've bled over.
You know, making sure that you know the project up and down and you've gone through it yourself, you know what I mean? Making sure you're prepared for any of the challenges that might come up. You know, I know when we just had them build a cannon, a rubber band cannon, but one thing that I did was because there wasn't enough room in the classroom to hold the competition, and I didn't want to bother the other classes, so I took them out. Then I didn't think about the wind, because they were just rubber bands, you know, so the wind would carry them. So the kids were like, oh, it's not fair, you know, the wind took it, and it became, you know, because they get real competitive. So we ended up getting in a circle and blocking the wind, you know, and things like that, but I guess now I know better. to, you know, maybe find a spot that we can do it in, or tell the teachers we're gonna go into the hallway, so it might be a little bit of noise, you know, something like that, but just, being prepared.
Yeah.
For me, it was the classroom management aspect of it. When you're up there just lecturing and everyone's silent, it's easy to kind of manage, you know, stop talking. But whenever you're doing a project where they're allowed to either work in groups or work on their own, making sure, you know, there's talking, it's noisy, people are getting up, moving around, getting supplies, and it's that classroom management aspect of being able to make sure everyone's doing what they're supposed to be doing while still moving around and still talking and still kind of collaborating. That kind of classroom management, you really have to kind of step it up to the next level and kind of letting go of that control. As a teacher, it's so much nice having a control. Okay, everyone, this is your seat. You are not moving from the seat. I can control you from this seat. But letting control and being like, yes, you're allowed to get up if you want to go measure something over here, or go get supplies from over here, or go check on what someone's doing over here. Letting go of that control, but at the same time still having the classroom management skills. It was definitely something to really kind of focus on a lot. And then the other one was, you have to know your students really well, I feel like, to do some of these projects. You have to know the kind of kids who are going to work well with each other, the kids that aren't going to work well with each other, the kids that maybe let them work on it by themselves, you know, that they don't work well with others, like especially special ed, some of the people that have like emotional disabilities, and just really know your students and know the ones that you need to be on top of and the ones that you're okay with them, you know, kind of being in the corner because you know they're going to get their stuff done and that kind of stuff. Just the class. Yes. So just knowing your students and knowing your classroom management skills.
I think in the same line of thought as control and like giving up that control is we wrote down you have to be a facilitator rather than a director, and you're there to facilitate the students to take responsibility for their own learning rather than direct them, because all too often they'll ask a question and I find myself, you know, giving them the answer right away, and in this I had to pull back, and I find myself doing that even outside of PBL. When I am, you know, traditionally teaching, I will, you know, not directly give them the answer. Instead, I'll, you know, have them search for it, or because it's easy to, you know, they raise their hand, they ask, oh yeah, that's the answer to that, you know, and if it's in a not an answer on the test or anything, but you know what I mean. And so, in facilitating them taking responsibility for their own learning, I think was a big one.
Yeah, that's tough, right? I mean, that's not an easy thing you can just do blind, right? Okay, what else? Role of teacher. Or are there? So did you find when you were going throughout your semester that you were doing these things in other aspects of your teaching, or not really? Katie.
Something that it was a bit of a struggle for me, and it is doing project-based learning, but knowing what my students know before doing a project and how much information to tell them and how much not to tell them, and what is the balance of they're struggling and suffering through to figure it out, or they shut down. Because a lot of my kids, when I'm doing a lesson, if they like, the second that they don't understand something, they just shut down. And they're like, I can't do this. Even though I saw them do it the day before. And we're doing basically the same thing as we did yesterday, but today you can't do it, even though you did it yesterday. So finding the balance of that, and knowing it kind of goes back to knowing your students really well and having a really good relationship with your students and being able to support them. And everything, but definitely with project-based learning.
I guess at the same time, it needs to be a balance, because I guess for me, one of the things was learning to let my students struggle a little bit instead of doing it immediately or coming to their rescue, that they have that point of confusion, I guess, to use an AVID term, is a good thing that they need to go and get beyond. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing that has affected the rest of my teaching, is that recognizing that point of struggle as a good thing.
And finding that sweet spot where it's like they're a productive struggle and not just a frustrating
Not just a
struggle
giving
or
up,
it's too
yes.
easy. Yeah.
Going along with that, your questioning techniques really changed quite a bit.
Okay.
You know, it's
How?
not the direct question, but an indirect question or some guidance along the way, so that you can help them find a resolution to their problem without really giving them the answer.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, great discussion. If y'all will leave your, can I see that hand up? So I can check everybody. This one, no, the survey I have nothing to do with. This one, where the questions with the places for you to answer, we do want to pick those up from you, just as, you don't have to put your names on them or anything, we just are going to look at these as data. So if you will hand those to either me or Dr. Carmona, that would be great. And we're going to use the next maybe half hour or so to do a gallery walk so you guys can see each other's projects. And the way that we'll probably facilitate that is that if you worked in a group, maybe half of the group members could stay with the poster while the other half circulate and then switch. Yeah?
As a